How you doing? My name's Evelegh and welcome to my workshop. This video is part one of a three-part series I'm doing on dovetails. I'm really excited about this series because I've got a lot of advice and a lot of tips I want to give you to improve your dovetail cutting. The first part, this video, is going to be on beginner's mistakes. I've got a lot of tips to correct those. The next part will be on tips and tricks to cutting better dovetails, and part 3 will be cutting dovetails the Master-craftsman way. So I can't wait to get going, but before we get into it, I just want to do a disclaimer. Some of the points I'm going to bring up are my own opinion, and other woodworkers might do it in a different way. And some people might like a 45-degree angle on their tails. I don't. So if you're new to woodworking or you just want to improve your dovetails, then I promise you, if you follow the tips I talk about in these 3 videos, your dovetails will look amazing and they'll look like a master craftsman cut them. So let's get right into it with beginner's mistakes. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is layout. I think layout is probably one of the main things beginners rush on, but actually layout is probably one of the most important things you need to do to make your dovetails look good. Now, you can cut the best dovetail ever with no gaps at all, but if the tails and the pins are wrongly sized, it can look very messy. So I've drawn some pictures here of what you shouldn't be doing. The first thing is ratio. Now, this is probably the only point where it is really personal opinion, and you can do any ratio you like, but in my opinion, I always go for a 1:8 ratio. I think that's the most elegant looking. I think the further you go towards 45 degrees, it starts to look quite tacky, a bit like this dovetail. These dovetails are nearly at 45 degrees, and as you can see, it doesn't look that good. And not only is the aesthetics wrong, you get into issue with the grain, and there's not a lot of supporting grain here, so those tails can break at the ends. So, in my opinion, 1:8 ratio is the way to go. The second mistake a lot of beginners make is on the end of the dovetails, the pins are too small. Hopefully you can see in this picture, a lot of people make the edge of the tail go right to the end of the board, and that makes that end pin very weak. And there's not any supporting material on the other side of the pin, so that can break off. I always start the point of my first tail 5mm into the board. Another thing with aesthetics is you never want to have half tails on the end of your dovetails. Now, your dovetail would still work if you had half tails on the end, but they're never really done like that, and I think it looks wrong. So you probably want to do it the traditional way, just end with a pin. And the last point I want to make about layout is the size of your pins. Now, in my opinion, if you're going through all the effort of hand cutting dovetails, you don't want to make the dovetails look like a machine could have done it. And the only way you can make the dovetails look like they're hand done is making the pins small enough that a router bit can't fit in them. So I see a lot of dovetails where the pins are pretty much the same size as the tails, and as you can see, the pins are so big it looks like a router could have done that joint. So on average with my dovetails, the top of the pin is around 3mm, which is far too small for the shank of a router bit to fit in between the tails and remove that material. So I definitely recommend having wide tails and very thin pins. Let's move to the next point. Okay, so my next point is on marking out the tails and the pins itself. This part is a little bit confusing, so I hope I explain it well. Quite simply, you should always mark out the tails with a pencil or a pen, and mark out the pins with a knife. And when I say the pins with a knife, you should only do the end grain with a knife. You should never mark the side grain on a dovetail with a knife. It's far too accurate, and it's very difficult following that knife line on the side grain. And if you end up marking out dovetails with a knife on the side grain and you don't cut on that, then it's quite likely to have that knife line show up in the final joint. Using a pencil for marking out the tails is basically a reference line. It's a guide to follow when you're cutting. The tails don't need to be so accurate because you haven't cut the pins yet. You cut the pins to fit the tails. So once you've cut the tails, you use the knife to mark the end grain on the top of the pins. Then I go back with a pencil with a square to mark down the face side of the board, so then I know I'm cutting plumb and square. Most dovetail markers are made out of wood, and they're not the right material for a knife, and you'll just end up cutting into the dovetail marker. That isn't why you should be using a pencil, but that shows why you shouldn't be using a knife. I hope that makes sense. Now, when marking out the baseline for your dovetails, make sure you don't score the line too deep, because then when you're flushing off the pins and the tails at the end, then you don't want that score line to still show in the final joint. And if you're worried about the chisel not engaging in that score line, then that means your chisel is not sharp enough. Your chisel should engage in the tiniest of marking lines. Another beginner's mistake is cutting on the wrong side of the line or cutting in the middle of the line. You definitely don't want to do that. A good idea is marking out the waist so you know which side of the line to cut on. And you always want to cut on the outside of the tail. Also when sawing, you don't want to saw past the baseline because that will definitely show in the end joint. So if you're not comfortable with sawing right up to the baseline, then you can stop just shy of it and then chisel back to it. And the last tip I have with cutting the tails is not turning the saw mid-cut. So remember, we haven't cut the pins yet. So if you go slightly off the line on the inside of the tail or the outside, that doesn't mean you're going to get a gap in the end result. Because we haven't cut the pins, whatever angle you cut this tail at, you're then going to reference off that face to mark out the pin, and then you're going to make the pin fit. Some people when cutting the tails, if they notice they're slightly going off the line, they'll turn the saw and try and get back on track. But that's a disaster, because if you have a tail wall that isn't flat and has a curve, either convex or concaved, then when you cut the pin, you're cutting downwards with the saw and you can't curve the saw curve. So then you will have a gap. So I'm going to draw a picture to explain that a bit better. So these are the angles I've already cut, and this is the line I want to go down. If I notice when I'm cutting the tail that I'm slightly wandering off the line and I decide to curve back in, then that means that tail wall is now curved. So now the tail wall has a curve like this, and then one flat side, and so on. But remember, the knife only cuts straight. So when we go to cut our pins, it's actually going to be angled like this, and then you're going to have a gap on the top and bottom. But if you decided not to turn the saw and you continue to cut straight, even if it's at a different ratio angle to all the other tails, you wouldn't notice as much because there'll be no gap. So make sure if the saw is slightly going off track to keep in that straight path, because cutting the pins will be a lot easier. And remember, when chiseling back to the baseline, if you chisel too much off, for example, if I were to put the chisel in that marking gauge line right now and start hammering away, because of the bevel on the chisel, it would actually be pushed back into the wood, and then I'm going to go past my baseline, and then when I put the joint together, there's going to be a gap at the bottom. So you want to nibble away little bits at a time, so then eventually when you put the chisel into that marking gauge line, there's so little material in front of it, that's not enough to force the chisel back. Okay, so the next beginner's mistake is about undercutting. Now undercutting is on the end grain, on the bottom of the pins, is where you cut a bit below the baseline, and that is to leave a slight void, so when the pins and the tails come together there is no risk of any high spots which won't allow the tails to seat properly, then causing gaps. So when undercutting there are two mistakes you can make. The first being you can undercut too much, which will make the joint weaker, and the second one is starting the undercut too close to the face edge. So if I bring you closer, I'll show you what that can do. So if I were to undercut this pin and I started right at the front of that and I dug down, later on when I flush off the joint with a hand plane, when flushing off the pins, if I go too far and start flushing off the tail board, then I can start to reveal that undercut, which will look like a gap at the bottom of the pin. So you want to start the undercut a couple of millimeters inside the tail board to eliminate that risk. So a good thing to do on your tail board is add a chamfer on the bottom of the tails, and that will help you locate it into the pins and get them in easier when putting the joint together. However, you don't want to cut those chamfers until you marked out the pins, of course, because you're going to reference a knife off the side of the tail, and if there's a chamfer there, then you're going to reference too far in. So now the tails are cut, the next step is to mark out the pins. Now, we're going to be marking these out with a knife. This marking out step is probably the most important marking out step in the whole of the dovetail cutting process. So this knife line has to be extremely accurate. But again, I'm going to use a pencil for the face grain to mark down with a square to make sure I'm cutting plumb. I don't want to do that with a knife. Alright, so the pins and the tails are cut. Now it's time to add the chamfer. When you're adding the chamfer, make sure you don't start at the end of the tail, because then when you put the joint together, you're going to see that chamfer. So you want to start quite far in, and also remember, when you marked out your baseline, how far did you make the pins and the tails overhang? So I did 1mm, so I want to go 1mm plus another couple. So then I probably want to start the chamfer 3mm into the tailboard. Alright, so the dovetail is done, so I'm going to add some glue, put it together, and then we can see how it looks. Alright, and that is the dovetail complete. It's come out very nicely, there are no gaps, and again that 1:8 ratio I think looks great. I'm very happy with how this has come out. So I hope that video was helpful. If you are a beginner and you are making some mistakes, hopefully some of the points I made in this video have helped you out. So make sure you watch my next two videos, which will be on dovetailing tips and tricks. I got some really good tips and tricks, I guess as the name implies, on cutting really nice dovetails, and the third video, which is how to cut a dovetail like a master craftsman. They should be very good videos, and they all got different points in each, so I won't be repeating anything. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like. If you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe, it is free. So yeah, thank you for sticking to the end of the video, and I'll see you next week for part 2.